If you refuse to go to a nursing home, then pack your things and get out of my house." Those were the words Thomas shouted, glaring straight into his father's eyes. Arthur Pendleton stayed silent, offering only a faint, knowing smile. The 68-year-old retired professor calmly walked upstairs, carefully packed his worn philosophy books, gently tucked away the faded photographs of his late wife, Eleanor, and snapped his vintage leather suitcase shut. An hour later, a gleaming black Maybach glided to a halt in the freezing Boston cold outside the house. When Thomas opened the front door and saw exactly who had come to pick his father up, the arrogant smirk vanished from his face. It was as if the icy ground had completely fallen out from under his feet. The chauffeur, clad in a crisp dark suit, stepped out into the swirling snow and opened the rear door. From the plush interior emerged Richard Sterling. The tech billionaire, a man whose face frequently graced the covers of global financial magazines, buttoned his tailored cashmere overcoat against the bitter wind. He did not look at the magnificent suburban house. He did not look at the son standing paralyzed in the doorway. Richard walked straight toward the porch where Arthur stood with his battered suitcase. "Arthur," Richard said, his voice carrying a warmth that defied the freezing temperature. "Are you ready to go?" Arthur nodded slowly. He picked up his suitcase, but Richard gently took it from his hands, passing it to the waiting chauffeur. Thomas finally found his voice, though it sounded weak, hollow, and trembling. "Mr. Sterling, what are you doing here?" "Dad, how do you know him?" Richard slowly turned his head, his piercing gaze landing on Thomas for a brief, freezing second. There was no anger in the billionaire's eyes, only a profound, suffocating disdain. He did not utter a single syllable to the younger man. He simply offered his arm to Arthur. "Let us leave this place, my friend," Richard murmured softly. Through the frosted glass of the front window, Jessica watched the scene unfold. The designer coffee mug she was holding slipped from her manicured fingers, shattering into jagged pieces on the hardwood floor. The woman who had spent months treating her father-in-law like an unpaid servant now stared in sheer terror as a man worth billions escorted him away like royalty. Arthur stepped off the porch. He paused for a fraction of a second, feeling the biting winter wind against his wrinkled cheeks, and then settled into the soft leather seat of the Maybach. The heavy door closed with a muted thud, sealing away the panicked voice of his son. As the luxurious vehicle pulled away from the curb, Arthur looked through the tinted window one last time. Thomas was left standing ankle-deep in the snow, a pathetic figure shrinking in the rearview mirror until the white storm swallowed him completely. Inside the car, the air was warm and smelled faintly of expensive cedar and polished leather. The contrast between the harshness of the outside world and the absolute comfort of the cabin mirrored the sudden, violent shift in Arthur's reality. For a long time, the only sound was the quiet hum of the powerful engine and the rhythmic sweeping of the windshield wipers. Arthur stared at his own trembling hands resting on his lap. The adrenaline that had kept his posture straight and his face expressionless finally began to fade, leaving behind a crushing wave of physical and emotional exhaustion. Richard poured a glass of warm amber liquid from a crystal decanter and placed it gently into Arthur's hand. "Drink this," Richard said softly. "You survived the worst part." Arthur took a slow sip. The heat traveled down his throat, thawing the frozen block of grief residing in his chest. He closed his eyes, allowing the painful memories of the past 3 years to flood his mind. He thought about Eleanor. Eleanor with her bright laughter and her infinite patience. Before she passed away 5 years ago, she had held his hand in a hospital room and made him promise to stay close to Thomas. She had always believed in the goodness of their boy. Arthur had clung to that belief with a desperate, foolish grip. He had sold their house, the sanctuary where they had built decades of precious memories to fund Thomas's failing investment firm. He had moved into their guest room, which Jessica quickly downgraded to the damp basement storage space, claiming the upstairs room was urgently needed for her online yoga studio. He had given up his independence, his peace, and his wealth for the illusion of a happy family. Instead of love, he had received servitude. He remembered the mornings he woke up before dawn to scrub the kitchen counters because Jessica complained about his presence in the common areas. He remembered the day he tried to read a classic tale to his 9-year-old grandson, Leo. The boy had been sitting on his lap, completely engrossed in the story, until Jessica snatched the book away. She had claimed the old pages carried mold and that Arthur was filling the boy's head with useless, outdated nonsense. Thomas had stood right there in the hallway, adjusting his expensive silk tie, and said absolutely nothing. He had simply walked out the front door to go to work, leaving his father to swallow the bitter taste of humiliation alone. Arthur had endured it all because he believed endurance was an ultimate act of parental love. He thought his silence would eventually buy him a sliver of gratitude and secure his place near his grandchildren. How profoundly wrong he had been. His silence had not bought gratitude. It had only purchased contempt. A heavy sigh escaped Arthur's lips. The sorrow that had weighed him down for so long began to crystallize into something entirely different. It was no longer the blind, forgiving love of a father. It was the sharp, unyielding clarity of a scholar who finally understood the mathematical equation of human cruelty before him. He had tolerated the abuse because he feared losing his family. But today, standing on that snowy porch, looking into his son's cold eyes, Arthur realized he had no family left in that house. The boy he had raised was gone, replaced by a spineless puppet dangling from the strings of a greedy, manipulative woman. Arthur opened his eyes. The tears he had held back were entirely gone, replaced by a calm, calculated focus. He looked at Richard, his old college roommate, the man who had promised Eleanor he would always keep an eye on him. "Thank you for coming, Richard," Arthur said, his voice steady and devoid of its former fragility. "I told you I would always be here when you needed me," Richard replied, watching the city lights blur past the window. "What happens now, Arthur?" Arthur looked out at the towering skyscrapers of downtown Boston piercing through the dark winter clouds. The old, submissive man who had packed his bags an hour ago was dead. In his place sat a warrior who knew the true value of respect and the heavy price of betrayal. "Now," Arthur said quietly, "I teach them a lesson they will never forget." The Maybach glided into the secure underground parking of a towering glass high-rise in the heart of downtown Boston. The transition from the biting blizzard outside to the climate-controlled, softly lit garage felt like entering a different dimension. Richard led Arthur to a private elevator. The mirrored doors slid shut silently, and they ascended rapidly to the penthouse on the 52nd floor. When the doors parted, Arthur stepped into a realm of absolute tranquility. The penthouse was expansive, framed by floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the snow-covered city. There were no blaring televisions, no screaming children, and most importantly, no sharp, condescending voice echoing from down the hall. The silence was thick, luxurious, and initially, entirely overwhelming. For 3 long years, Arthur had conditioned his nervous system to be on constant high alert, waiting for Jessica's next demand or Thomas's next heavy, guilt-ridden sigh. Here, the air was still. It smelled of aged paper, leather, and fresh orchids, a stark contrast to the scent of bleach and stale coffee that permeated his basement corner at his son's house. "Your room is down the hall to the right," Richard said gently, pointing toward a corridor lined with subtle, warm lighting. "It has its own balcony and a small library. Make yourself at home, Arthur." truly." Arthur nodded his thanks, gripping his vintage leather suitcase tightly. He walked down the corridor and opened the door. The bedroom was larger than the entire first floor of the home he had just been thrown out of. A massive king-sized bed sat in the center, covered in pristine white linens. Beside it stood a wall of mahogany bookshelves, already stocked with classic literature and philosophical texts. Arthur set his suitcase at the foot of the bed and walked over to the glass window. He pressed his wrinkled hand against the cold pane, looking down at the tiny, moving lights of the cars below. The physical distance from his son's house was only a few miles, but the emotional chasm was immeasurable. Standing in the quiet warmth, the dam inside him finally broke. The memories he had desperately suppressed to survive his daily existence began to surface, sharp and vivid. He remembered the humiliating afternoons spent standing in the kitchen, carefully ironing Jessica's expensive silk blouses. She had claimed she could not trust the dry cleaners with delicate fabrics, but the cruel reality was that she simply enjoyed watching a former university professor perform menial labor for her. He thought of little Leo and Mia. His heart ached with a physical pain when their faces crossed his mind. He remembered spending hours crafting lesson plans, trying to teach Leo the fundamentals of mathematics and history, hoping to pass on his love for learning. But Jessica would inevitably interrupt, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness as she told the boy that his grandfather's methods were obsolete. She would shoo the children away, instructing Arthur to focus on cleaning the patio instead. She had deliberately and systematically stripped away his dignity, reducing the patriarch of the family to an unwanted, invisible ghost haunting the corners of their pristine home. And Thomas. The thought of his son brought a different kind of agony. Thomas had witnessed every insult, every sigh of disgust from his wife, and every silent tear his father shed in the shadows. Yet, Thomas had chosen the path of least resistance. He had traded his father's dignity for a fragile, toxic peace in his marriage. Arthur realized now that his own endless patience had been a fatal error. As a philosopher, Arthur had spent his life studying the human condition, reading about the traps of the ego and the illusion of control. He realized he had fallen into the most fundamental trap of all. He had been clinging desperately to the idea of a family, holding tightly to a picture that had long since burned to ashes. He had thought his endless sacrifices would eventually awaken a sense of duty and love in his son. Instead, his willingness to be treated like dirt had only taught Thomas that cowardice had no consequences. By constantly absorbing the abuse, Arthur had not saved his family. He had enabled a monster in his daughter-in-law and cultivated a coward in his son. The realization was as liberating as it was devastating. He had spent years trying to force the universe to fit his ideal narrative, fighting against the current of reality. Now, the illusion was shattered. The heavy burden of trying to keep a broken family together slipped from his shoulders. He did not need to pretend anymore. He did not need to force a polite smile when he was insulted. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Richard entered carrying a silver tray with a steaming pot of Earl Grey tea and 2 porcelain cups. He set the tray on a small wooden table near the window and poured the fragrant liquid. "You have been quiet for a long time," Richard noted, handing Arthur a cup. "Are you mourning them?" "No," Arthur replied softly, taking the warm cup in both hands. "I am mourning the man I allowed myself to become. I thought I was protecting Thomas by staying silent. I thought I was being the anchor. But an anchor only drags you down into the dark when the ship is already sinking." Richard took a sip of his tea, his eyes studying his old friend. "Eleanor would have hated seeing you in that basement, Arthur. She loved your pride." "Eleanor is the reason I stayed," Arthur confessed, his voice steadying. "I promised her I would look after him. But looking after someone does not mean letting them destroy you. Thomas needs a wake-up call. A harsh, unforgiving encounter with reality. And Jessica needs to understand that her actions carry weight. "What do you need from me?" Richard asked, his tone shifting from a comforting friend to a man of immense resources and absolute power. "I need clarity," Arthur said, turning away from the window and looking directly at the billionaire. "I sold my home for $300,000 to invest in Thomas's firm. He claimed the market was unstable and the funds were tied up. I need to know exactly where my life savings went. I need to know the anatomy of his business. Because if I am going to tear down the false life they have built, I must know where the foundation is cracked." Richard offered a sharp, predatory smile. "Consider it done. I know the best corporate lawyer in Boston. We will open Thomas's life like a book, and we will read every dirty secret written on the pages." Arthur nodded, taking a sip of the bitter tea. The warmth of the penthouse no longer felt like a sanctuary for a defeated old man. It felt like a command center. The professor had stopped teaching out of love and was now preparing to deliver his final, most devastating lecture. 2 mornings later, the Boston sky was a canvas of bleak, unforgiving gray. Richard Sterling's private driver navigated the icy streets toward the financial district, pulling up to a towering skyscraper composed of sharp steel and dark glass. Arthur walked beside his old friend into the immaculate lobby, his posture straighter than it had been in years. They took the private elevator to the 40th floor, arriving at the offices of Oliver Sampson, widely regarded as the most ruthless corporate attorney in the city. Oliver awaited them in a sprawling conference room adorned with dark walnut paneling and shelves of leather-bound legal volumes. He was a man of sharp angles, wearing a tailored navy suit and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him an air of absolute precision. He greeted Richard with deep respect, but his attention quickly shifted to the retired professor. Oliver extended a firm hand, inviting Arthur to sit opposite him at the massive polished table. Without engaging in unnecessary small talk, Oliver opened a thick blue folder. He looked directly at Arthur, his expression entirely clinical. "Mr. Pendleton, Richard asked me to conduct a forensic sweep of your financial ties to your son's investment firm. We pulled the banking records, the corporate filings, and the asset transfers from the past 3 years. What we found is highly disturbing." Arthur folded his hands on the table, bracing himself. "Tell me about the house." "I sold it for $300,000 and handed the check to Thomas. He told me it was placed into a secure family investment fund." Oliver shook his head slowly. "There was no investment fund, Arthur. The money was deposited into a joint checking account held by Thomas and his wife, Jessica. From there, it was systematically drained over the course of 36 months. The funds were not used for business capital. They were liquidated through discretionary spending. Designer clothing, luxury vehicles, high-end spa retreats, and frequent dining at the most expensive restaurants in the city. Your life savings simply funded their lifestyle." Arthur absorbed the blow in silence. The money was gone. The home he had shared with Eleanor, the walls that had echoed with her laughter, had been traded away for Jessica's superficial vanity. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but it was not entirely unexpected given what he had witnessed in their home. He let out a slow breath, nodding once. "I understand," Arthur said quietly. "It is money. Money can be lost." Oliver paused, his wire-rimmed glasses catching the harsh fluorescent light above. He leaned forward, his voice dropping an octave. "The stolen house funds are a minor issue compared to what we uncovered yesterday afternoon. Arthur, the situation is much worse than a mismanaged checking account." Oliver slid a heavily stamped, notarized document across the smooth wood of the table. Arthur looked down. It was a commercial loan agreement from a major national bank. Arthur had dedicated his entire career to academia. He had authored several seminal textbooks on modern philosophy and moral ethics, texts that were currently required reading in universities across the country. Those books were his intellectual lifeblood. They were his legacy, representing decades of solitary research, late nights in the university library, and a deep commitment to the pursuit of truth. "Your son's firm began collapsing 2 years ago," Oliver explained softly. To keep it afloat and maintain the illusion of success, Thomas required a massive injection of capital. The banks refused to lend to him without substantial collateral. So, he provided it. Oliver pointed a manicured finger at the document. "He leveraged the ongoing royalties and the copyright ownership of your entire intellectual property portfolio. Your life's work was used to secure a corporate loan. The total debt tied to your name, with accumulating interest, is $2 million. Arthur stared at the final page of the contract. At the bottom, next to the official bank seals, was his signature. It looked remarkably similar to his actual handwriting, mimicking the elegant loops he had perfected over a lifetime of writing on blackboards. But the slant was slightly off, the pressure of the pen too heavy. "I never signed this," Arthur whispered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "I would never put my work in jeopardy. He forged it." "We know," Richard said, his voice thick with suppressed rage. "We already have a handwriting expert standing by to testify. Your son committed felony fraud." For several long minutes, the conference room fell into an absolute, suffocating silence. Richard and Oliver watched the old professor carefully, waiting for the inevitable explosion of grief or anger. They expected him to shout, to break down, to curse the heavens for raising a son capable of such profound betrayal. Instead, Arthur experienced a profound, terrifying stillness. The anger inside him did not erupt outward like a volcano, it collapsed inward, compacting into a dense, unbreakable core of ice. This was not merely financial theft. Thomas had stolen his identity. He had taken his father's lifelong dedication to ethics and truth and used it to fund a lie. The sheer irony of using books on moral philosophy to commit a massive fraud was not lost on Arthur. Thomas was not just a coward hiding behind his wife, he was a desperate criminal who had willingly offered his father's legacy as a sacrificial lamb. Arthur slowly closed the blue folder. He looked up, his eyes entirely devoid of warmth. The gentle grandfather who had read stories to Leo and Mia was gone, locked away until the impending war was won. In his place sat a master strategist. "If he defaults on this loan," Arthur said, his voice chillingly calm, "the bank seizes my copyrights. I lose the rights to my own words." "Yes," Oliver confirmed. "And based on his current financial trajectory, he will default within the next 3 months." Arthur turned to Richard. "A philosopher once wrote that a man cannot be betrayed by his enemies, only by his friends and family. Because only they hold the keys to his weakest gates. Thomas took my keys and invited the thieves inside." Arthur stood up from the table, his posture rigid and imposing. He looked at Oliver with the authoritative gaze of a man preparing to deliver a final verdict. "Draft the lawsuit," Arthur commanded. "I want every single document prepared. I want the forgery charges, the financial fraud, and the embezzlement outlined in excruciating detail. But do not file it yet." Oliver raised an eyebrow. "Why wait?" "Because Thomas is only the symptom," Arthur replied, buttoning his tweed jacket. "Jessica is the disease. She is the one driving his desperation. If we strike now, she will find the way to escape the wreckage and leave him to burn alone. Before I dismantle my son, I need to know exactly what his wife is hiding." Richard smiled, a predatory gleam in his eyes. "I have already contacted the best private investigators in the state. They started tailing her this morning. The operatives Richard hired were phantoms in the Boston winter. They were former intelligence agents who specialized in corporate espionage and high-wealth marital disputes. Armed with encrypted communication devices and long-range cameras, they melted into the background of the city. Their sole objective was Jessica Pendleton. While Arthur remained in the serene sanctuary of the penthouse reading his ancient texts, the invisible net around his daughter-in-law was being woven tighter with every passing hour. Exactly 21 days had passed since the Maybach pulled away from the suburban driveway. Inside the Pendleton residence, the facade of a perfect, upper-class life was crumbling with terrifying speed. Without Arthur there to act as the invisible pillar holding the household together, the reality of their existence became undeniable. The pristine hardwood floors, once meticulously polished every morning by the retired professor, were now stained with dried mud and crusted rock salt from the snowstorms. The kitchen sink was a towering monument of dirty dishes, emitting a sour odor that drifted into the living room. The laundry room overflowed with expensive clothing that neither Thomas nor Jessica knew how to properly care for. The house had become a battleground. Jessica paced the living room floor, stepping over scattered toys, her face flushed with absolute rage. She was wearing premium activewear, holding her smartphone, and screaming at her husband. "I cannot film my yoga sessions in this squalor, Thomas," she yelled, her voice echoing off the bare walls. "My online followers are asking why the background of my videos looks like a cheap motel. You need to hire a maid service today. I will not ruin my nails scrubbing these floors." Thomas sat on the edge of the expensive leather sofa, his head buried in his hands. The dark circles under his eyes were deep and bruised, a physical manifestation of his mounting terror. He looked up at his wife, his voice weak and exhausted. "We cannot afford a maid service right now, Jessica. The firm is hemorrhaging cash. I told you I need to cut expenses." "Then you clean it," she snapped back, glaring at him with unfiltered disgust. "Your father used to have breakfast ready by 7 and the house spotless by 8. Since you decided to let him leave, you can take over his duties. I am a brand ambassador, not a housekeeper." The hypocrisy of her words hit Thomas like a physical blow, but as always, he swallowed his anger. He lacked the spine to remind her that it was her constant complaining and cruelty that had driven his father out of the house. Instead, Thomas simply lowered his head back into his hands, retreating into his shell. A loud crash from the kitchen startled them both. Thomas rushed in to find 9-year-old Leo standing on a chair, trying to reach a box of cereal from the top cabinet. The boy had knocked over a glass vase, shattering it across the tiled floor. 6-year-old Mia was sitting at the dining table, crying softly because her stomach hurt and no one had made her dinner. "What are you doing?" Thomas asked, his voice cracking. Leo looked at his father, his young eyes filled with a mixture of defiance and profound sadness. "Grandpa always made us warm oatmeal when it snowed. Mom said she was too busy to cook. I am hungry." Thomas felt a sharp, suffocating pain in his chest. He looked at the shattered glass, then at his neglected children, and finally at the empty corner of the kitchen where his father used to sit and read the morning paper. The absence of Arthur was a gaping hole in their lives. The professor had not just been a free servant. He had been the only source of genuine warmth and stability in a house built on vanity and debt. Thomas finally realized the magnitude of his mistake. He had traded the only person who truly loved him unconditionally to appease a woman who only loved his wallet. Leaving Jessica to yell at the children about the broken glass, Thomas retreated to his home office and locked the heavy oak door. The room was dark, illuminated only by the harsh blue light of his laptop screen. Spread across his desk were overdue notices, threatening letters from creditors, and the looming reality of the $2 million bank loan. The walls were closing in. He was drowning in his failing business and suffocating in his toxic marriage. Desperation, raw and metallic, clawed at his throat. He needed his father. He needed the calm, steady voice of the professor to tell him everything would be all right, to offer a solution, or perhaps just to offer another silent sacrifice. Thomas pulled his smartphone from his pocket. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely unlock the screen. He scrolled down to the contact labeled simply as Dad. He pressed the green button and held the phone to his ear, closing his eyes, praying to hear Arthur's familiar, comforting tone. The line clicked. There was no ringing. A sterile, automated voice echoed in his ear, stating that the subscriber you are trying to reach is not accepting calls at this time. Thomas pulled the phone away, staring at the screen in disbelief. He dialed again. The same automated voice responded. He tried sending a text message, begging for forgiveness, asking for just 5 minutes to talk. A red exclamation point appeared instantly. Message failed to deliver. His father had blocked him. The realization settled over Thomas like a thick, heavy blanket of snow. Arthur Pendleton, the man who had endured years of humiliation just to be near his family, had completely severed the connection. The silence from the other end of the line was not just a technical barrier. It was a profound, terrifying punishment. Thomas dropped the phone onto the desk and wept in the dark, finally understanding the true cost of his cowardice. Meanwhile, across the city, the private investigators were finalizing a report that would ensure Thomas's tears were only just beginning. The following morning, the fierce blizzard over Boston finally broke, leaving behind a brittle, blindingly bright sky. Inside the penthouse, the absolute silence was shattered by the heavy thud of a thick manila folder landing on the polished mahogany dining table. Richard Sterling stood across from Arthur, his expression unusually grim. The billionaire had seen countless acts of corporate espionage and ruthless betrayals in his career, but the contents of the envelope had genuinely disgusted him. The investigators finished their work, Richard said quietly, taking a seat opposite his friend. It is significantly worse than we anticipated, Arthur. Arthur set down his porcelain teacup. He untied the string of the folder and opened the cover. The first 24 pages were high-resolution photographs, crisp and undeniably clear. There was Jessica, wearing the expensive designer cashmere coat bought with Arthur's life savings, walking into the lobby of an upscale, discreet boutique hotel. Her arm was entwined tightly with a heavily muscled man easily 10 years her junior. The attached dossier identified him as Ethan, a local high-end fitness instructor. Several other photos showed them kissing intimately in the underground parking garage. Arthur felt a flicker of profound pity for his son, but it was entirely analytical rather than emotional. Thomas had sacrificed his father, his dignity, and his financial stability for a woman who was actively and shamelessly betraying him. Thomas had traded a father's unconditional love for a liar's hollow validation. Arthur turned to the next section of the report, which detailed financial anomalies outside of the failing investment firm. His eyes scanned the highlighted bank statements and pawn shop receipts, and his breath suddenly hitched. Eleanor had possessed a magnificent collection of vintage European watches, rare heirlooms passed down through 3 generations of her family. Her favorite had been an exquisite, rose gold timepiece she wore every anniversary. After she died, Arthur had kept them safely in a velvet-lined cedar box in his bedroom closet. Shortly before Arthur was forced into the basement, Jessica had claimed the box was accidentally lost during a charity donation purge. The documents proved a much darker reality. She had systematically sold the heirlooms to private antique dealers across the state. The proceeds, totaling nearly $80,000, had not gone toward saving Thomas's sinking business or feeding the family. The money had been securely routed into a hidden offshore account and then used as a down payment for a luxury condominium downtown, registered solely under Jessica's maiden name. She was quietly building a lavish escape pod using Eleanor's sacred legacy, preparing to abandon Thomas the moment his firm officially collapsed. The sheer audacity of the theft stunned, but Arthur remained collected. He was a philosopher. He understood that material objects, even precious ones, were transient. But as he turned to the final tab of the folder, labeled with a stark red sticker indicating child welfare concerns, the academic detachment vanished entirely. Arthur braced himself, but nothing could have prepared him for the visceral, agonizing punch of the next few images. This was not financial fraud or marital infidelity. It was raw, documented, heartbreaking neglect. There was a photograph of 9-year-old Leo sitting completely alone on a frozen concrete bench outside his elementary school gates. The timestamp read 5:15 in the evening. The boy's thin winter jacket was entirely inadequate for the biting wind, his small shoulders hunched against the falling snow as he waited for a mother who had simply forgotten him. Another photo showed 6-year-old Mia wandering the aisles of a local pharmacy, her eyes red from crying, entirely unsupervised while her mother was inside a nearby luxury tanning salon. The investigative notes detailed a consistent, horrifying pattern over the past 3 weeks. While Jessica spent her afternoons at high-end spas and hotel rooms with her lover, the children were left entirely to fend for themselves. They were eating processed junk food, missing school assignments, and spending hours locked out of the house in the freezing cold. Without Arthur there to act as their guardian, their tutor, and their chef, Leo and Mia were being treated as inconvenient burdens. The profound, meditative calm that Arthur had maintained instantly evaporated. The theft of his money was a legal matter. The forgery of his signature was a criminal offense. The infidelity was a tragedy for his spineless son. But the suffering of his grandchildren was an absolute, unforgivable sin. It crossed the one defining red line he possessed. The image of little Leo shivering in the snow burned itself into Arthur's retinas, incinerating the last remaining fragments of his patience and his mercy. Arthur slowly closed the heavy folder. His hands were no longer shaking. His posture locked into the rigid, unyielding stance of a commander preparing for total war. The time for observation and strategy was over. The gentle, submissive professor was dead and buried beneath the Boston snow. "Richard," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, absolute zero that made the billionaire sit up straighter. "I want a table booked for tomorrow night. The most exclusive, visible restaurant in the city. And tell Oliver to prepare the initial legal notices. We will not wait for Thomas to default." Richard leaned forward, recognizing the lethal, irreversible shift in his old friend's eyes. "Are you going to confront them directly?" "I am going to execute the first phase of their dismantling," Arthur replied. He carefully extracted the photograph of his shivering grandson from the folder and placed it into his breast pocket, resting it right above his heart as a permanent reminder of his mission. "Jessica believes she has won because I walked away. She believes Thomas is a permanent shield she can hide behind without consequence. It is time to show them both that they have built their arrogant little kingdom on a massive fault line, and I am the earthquake." Exactly 21 days after he walked out of their front door into the Boston blizzard, Arthur Pendleton broke his silence. He did not call. He did not send a desperate text message. Instead, a formal courier delivered a crisp, heavy stock envelope to Thomas and Jessica. Inside was a reservation card for Los Summit, the most exclusive and notoriously expensive dining establishment in the city, accompanied by a brief note bearing only the time and date. When Thomas and Jessica arrived at the restaurant, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of roasted truffles and old money. Jessica wore a new designer dress, her posture radiating a forced, arrogant confidence. She assumed the old man had finally realized how cold and unforgiving the real world was and wanted to beg for his basement room back. Thomas walked beside her, his face pale, his hands sweating. He just wanted the nightmare of the past 3 weeks to end. The maitre d' led them to a secluded, private alcove illuminated by a cascading crystal chandelier. Sitting at the head of the table was not the hunched, exhausted servant they remembered. Arthur wore a tailored, vintage charcoal tweed suit, a crisp white shirt, and a silk tie. His silver hair was perfectly groomed. He sat completely upright, his hands resting gracefully on the white linen tablecloth. He radiated the commanding, unshakable aura of a senior university professor about to fail his worst-performing students. "Dad," Thomas breathed, taking a tentative step forward, his eyes darting around the luxurious space. "You look different. How are you paying for this?" "Sit down," Arthur instructed. His voice was not loud, but it possessed a sharp, cutting authority that made both of them freeze. Jessica recovered her composure quickly. She offered a tight, condescending smile and took her seat, crossing her legs. "Arthur, we are very busy people. If this is your way of apologizing for your dramatic exit, a simple phone call would have sufficed. The children miss their tutor, and the house is a mess. We are willing to let you move back in, provided you agree to a few new ground rules." Arthur looked at his daughter-in-law. He did not blink. He did not show a trace of anger. He simply observed her the way a biologist might observe a highly toxic, yet intellectually fascinating insect. "I did not invite you here to discuss domestic chores, Jessica," Arthur said, his tone dropping the temperature at the table by several degrees. "And I certainly did not invite you here to apologize." Without breaking eye contact, Arthur reached into the interior pocket of his tweed jacket. He extracted a thick, sealed brown envelope and dropped it onto the center of the table. The heavy paper landed with a dull, final thud. "What is this?" Thomas asked, his voice trembling slightly. "Open it and read," Arthur commanded. Thomas reached out with shaky fingers and broke the seal. He pulled out the stack of papers. The color instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a polished corpse. The top document was a detailed forensic bank statement showing the exact trajectory of the $300,000 from the sale of Arthur's home. The highlighted lines tracked the money flowing directly from their joint account to luxury boutiques, 5-star resorts, and high-end automotive dealerships. Jessica leaned over to look. Her confident smirk vanished, replaced by a rigid mask of panic. "My life savings," Arthur began, his voice slicing through the ambient hum of the restaurant, "were not lost in a volatile market. They were liquidated to fund your insatiable vanity, Jessica. You treated my sacred history with Eleanor as a limitless credit card." "Dad, I can explain," Thomas stammered, dropping the papers. The firm was struggling. We needed to project success to attract new clients. It was an investment in our image. Arthur ignored the pathetic excuse. He gestured to the remaining papers in Thomas's trembling hands. "Keep reading, Thomas. We have not reached the climax of your moral bankruptcy." Thomas flipped to the next page. It was a copy of the $2 million commercial bank loan, secured by the copyrights to Arthur's academic textbooks. The forged signature glared back at him, a silent scream of betrayal. Thomas dropped the paper as if it had physically burned him. He buried his face in his hands, unable to meet his father's eyes. "You forged my signature to collateralize my life's work," Arthur said, the academic detachment in his voice making the accusation sound even more terrifying. "You committed felony fraud, Thomas. You stole my past to fund your wife's present, and then you mortgaged my legacy to delay your inevitable future." "Arthur, you are overreacting," Jessica hissed, leaning forward, her eyes darting around to see if anyone was listening. "He is your son. Families help each other. You cannot possibly threaten your own flesh and blood over some paperwork." Arthur turned his gaze back to Jessica. The absolute absence of mercy in his eyes made her physically recoil. "You have absolutely no right to speak to me," Arthur stated softly, yet the menace in his words was suffocating. "You turned me into a servant. You banished me to a damp cellar. You lied to my face every single day. And you did it all while spending the money I bled to earn." "Dad, please," Thomas begged, tears spilling over his cheeks. "I am sorry. I was terrified. If the firm goes under, I lose everything." "You have already lost everything, Thomas," Arthur replied, leaning back in his chair, adjusting his cuffs. "You just lack the intelligence to realize it yet. You traded your integrity for a facade." Arthur placed his hands flat on the table, leaning forward slightly to deliver the final blow of the evening. "My attorneys have drafted a comprehensive civil lawsuit and a criminal complaint regarding the forgery," Arthur declared. "You have exactly 14 days to return the $300,000 and completely sever my name from that fraudulent commercial loan. If you fail to do so, I will submit the evidence to the federal authorities. You will face a lengthy prison sentence, Thomas, and your firm will be publicly liquidated." 14 days. Thomas gasped, looking up with wide, terrified eyes. "That is impossible. I do not have that kind of capital. Dad, please, you will destroy me." Arthur stood up slowly, towering over them both. He looked down at the pathetic man crying into his expensive napkin and the venomous woman sitting frozen in fear beside him. "I am not destroying you, Thomas," Arthur said, turning away from the table. "I am simply holding up a mirror. What you do with the reflection is entirely your own problem." Arthur walked out of the restaurant, his footsteps echoing with absolute authority, leaving his son and daughter-in-law drowning in the wreckage of their own lies. The drive back to the suburbs was suffocatingly silent. Thomas gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, his mind spiraling into a dark abyss of impending prison sentences and public ruin. Beside him, Jessica stared out the passenger window. She was not crying. Fear, for a woman like Jessica, quickly metamorphosed into a venomous, calculating rage. She refused to lose her hidden offshore accounts, her luxury condominium, and her young lover. If Arthur wanted a war, she would give him one using the dirtiest weapons available. As soon as they entered their messy home, Thomas collapsed onto the sofa, burying his face in his hands. He mumbled about needing to confess, about selling everything to pay his father back. Jessica slapped him across the face. The sharp crack echoed in the living room, silencing his pathetic whimpers. "Pull yourself together," Jessica hissed, her eyes wild with a predatory glint. "If we admit guilt, we go to jail. We lose the house. We lose the children. Your father is a retired, grieving widower. We simply need to control the narrative. We need to prove his mind is deteriorating." Over the next 48 hours, Jessica orchestrated a masterpiece of malicious manipulation. She hired a ruthless family law attorney who specialized in aggressive litigation. Together, they drafted an emergency petition for a restraining order. In the sworn affidavits, Jessica painted a horrifying, entirely fabricated picture of the past 3 years. She claimed Arthur had been exhibiting severe signs of dementia and erratic, violent paranoia. She twisted the quiet afternoon when Arthur had packed his bags into a terrifying episode where he had supposedly screamed physical threats at her and the children. She stated, under penalty of perjury, that Arthur had stalked them at the restaurant and was an immediate, physical danger to 9-year-old Leo and 6-year-old Mia. When the court summons arrived at the downtown penthouse, Arthur felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. Oliver reviewed the documents, his jaw tightening with professional disgust. Oliver explained that family courts operated on an abundance of caution regarding child safety. Jessica was weaponizing the justice system to discredit Arthur before his financial fraud lawsuit could gain traction. The preliminary hearing took place on a bleak, gray Tuesday morning at the municipal courthouse. The air inside the small courtroom was stale and heavy. Arthur sat beside Oliver, maintaining his rigid, academic composure. Across the aisle, Jessica gave the performance of a lifetime. She had discarded her designer dresses for a cheap, wrinkled blouse. She wore no makeup, allowing the dark circles of her own stress to serve as evidence of her supposed terror. She wept silently, clutching a tissue, leaning against a deeply ashamed Thomas, who could not even lift his eyes from the scuffed wooden floor. Jessica's attorney spoke with theatrical urgency. He detailed Arthur's alleged mental decline, portraying the professor as a delusional, bitter old man seeking to destroy his own son out of senile paranoia. He presented the sudden appearance at the restaurant as stalking. "Your Honor," the opposing lawyer pleaded, pointing a dramatic finger toward Arthur. "My client lives in absolute terror. The minors have suffered severe psychological distress. We are asking for immediate protection before this tragic mental decline results in physical violence." Oliver stood to object, smoothly introducing the pending $2 million fraud litigation as the true motive behind Jessica's sudden fear. He argued that the restraining order was a calculated shield to delay financial justice. The judge, a stern woman with a lined face, listened carefully. However, the mandate of the family court was singular and unforgiving. When children were allegedly at risk, the court always erected a wall first and asked questions later. Given the severity of the allegations involving the minors, the judge declared, her gavel striking the wooden block with a sickening crack, "I am granting a temporary restraining order. Mr. Pendleton, you are hereby prohibited from coming within 500 feet of Thomas Pendleton, Jessica Pendleton, and the 2 minor children. All communication must cease immediately pending a full psychological and domestic evaluation." The words struck Arthur with the force of a physical blow. The air rushed out of his lungs. He looked across the room and saw Jessica hiding a triumphant, wicked smirk behind her crumpled tissue. She had found the one chink in his armor. The stolen money meant nothing to him. The forged legacy was a legal puzzle to solve. But Leo and Mia were his heart. They were the last living connections to Eleanor. By legally severing him from his grandchildren, Jessica had plunged a poisoned dagger directly into his soul. As Arthur walked out of the sterile courtroom into the freezing Boston air, a profound, agonizing darkness threatened to consume him. It was the deepest wound he had ever suffered, an emotional strike that left the brilliant professor momentarily blinded by raw, suffocating pain. The temporary restraining order felt like a physical weight pressing against Arthur's chest, threatening to crush his spirit entirely. For the first 24 hours after the court hearing, the retired professor barely moved from the leather armchair by the penthouse window. He stared out at the frozen Boston skyline, his mind tormented by the image of little Leo and Mia left at the mercy of a woman who viewed them only as props for her fabricated victimhood. Jessica had played a remarkably dirty game, striking at the only vulnerability he possessed. She expected him to crumble. She expected the grief of losing his grandchildren to force him into a desperate, unconditional surrender. But Jessica lacked the intellectual depth to understand the man she was fighting. She had mistaken a scholar's patience for weakness. As the second night fell over the city, the agonizing grief inside Arthur began to harden, compressing under the immense pressure of his righteous anger until it formed something entirely impenetrable. A warrior does not drop his sword when he sustains a wound. He simply learns to fight with a lethal, narrow focus. The heavy mahogany doors of the study opened, and Richard Sterling walked in, carrying a crystal decanter of aged scotch and 2 heavy glasses. The billionaire did not offer empty words of comfort. He knew Arthur did not need sympathy. He needed ammunition. Richard poured the amber liquid, the soft clinking of glass breaking the oppressive silence of the room. He handed a glass to his oldest friend and sat in the chair opposite him. "She won a battle built on a foundation of perjury," Richard said quietly, his eyes dark with calculated menace. "But while she was busy putting on a theatrical performance in family court, I was operating in the real world. We did not just sit idle, Arthur. We have been digging a trench around her entire existence." Arthur took a slow sip of the scotch, feeling the fire travel down his throat. "Tell me what you have done." A slow, predatory smile spread across Richard's face. "Thomas has been desperately trying to keep his investment firm afloat by taking on short-term, high-interest commercial loans from secondary lenders. He owes money to 6 different entities across the East Coast. Over the past 72 hours, my corporate acquisitions team has been quietly contacting every single one of those creditors." Richard reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket and extracted a single, crisp sheet of paper, sliding it across the low table toward Arthur. Using a network of anonymous shell corporations based out of Delaware, Richard explained, his voice vibrating with absolute power, "I have purchased every single outstanding debt your son owes. I bought his operational lines of credit, his vendor debts, and the mortgages on his office space. The shell companies are all legally controlled by a blind trust, and the sole beneficiary of that trust is you." Arthur looked at the paper. The numbers listed were astronomical, representing total financial ruin. "You did not just trap him," Arthur whispered, realizing the magnitude of his friend's maneuver. "No," Richard confirmed. "I bought him. You now legally own every debt Thomas Pendleton has. You hold the power to call in those loans at a moment's notice. With a single phone call, you can freeze his operational accounts, seize his business assets, and force his firm into involuntary bankruptcy. You hold the power of financial life and death over your son." The sheer scale of the counterattack breathed life back into Arthur. The net was not just tightening, it was made of solid steel. But the financial destruction of his son was only half of the equation. The following morning, attorney Oliver Sanson arrived at the penthouse, accompanied by the lead private investigator. They carried 2 massive, reinforced briefcases. They spread the contents across the dining table, creating a meticulous, horrifying map of Jessica's criminal endeavors. The forensic accountants finally cracked the offshore routing numbers, Oliver announced, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "Your son is a fool, but he is not the reason his firm is failing. We traced a series of highly sophisticated wire transfers originating directly from the firm's operational accounts. Jessica established herself as an independent consultant on the company payroll. Over the past 2 years, she has systematically embezzled over $400,000 of client funds. Arthur leaned forward, examining the highlighted ledgers. She was draining the company from the inside. Exactly, Oliver nodded. She used the embezzled corporate funds to maintain the luxury condominium for her lover and to fuel her private offshore accounts. Thomas was desperately forging your signature to secure a $2 million loan because his wife was actively bleeding his company dry. This is no longer just a civil matter of stolen savings. This is massive corporate fraud and grand larceny. The investigator stepped forward, opening the second briefcase. And we have the antidote for your restraining order, Mr. Pendleton. We knew the family court would demand more than just financial crimes to overturn a child's safety mandate. So, we gathered the ghosts she left behind. The investigator laid out a series of authenticated digital drives and sworn affidavits. We have high-definition surveillance footage from the condominium parking garage, proving her daily infidelity. More importantly, we secured sworn, notarized testimonies from Leo's school principal and 3 of their immediate neighbors. We have documented proof of her locking the children out of the house in freezing temperatures. We have medical records from the pharmacy where Mia was found wandering alone, suffering from a severe stress-induced rash while her mother was tanning. Oliver tapped the stack of affidavits. This is ironclad proof of severe child neglect and emotional abuse. When we present this to the family court judge alongside the evidence of her perjury and grand larceny, the restraining order will not just be lifted. Jessica will be stripped of all custody rights and immediately remanded into police custody. Arthur stood over the table, looking at the mountain of irrefutable evidence. Every lie Jessica had told, every dollar she had stolen, and every moment of suffering she had inflicted upon his grandchildren was documented, categorized, and weaponized. The darkness that had threatened to consume him outside the courthouse was entirely gone, replaced by the blinding, sterilizing light of absolute justice. Every escape route had been systematically sealed. The trap was perfectly set. Arthur looked at Oliver, his voice completely devoid of hesitation. Contact her attorney. Tell them we are demanding an immediate, mandatory mediation session at your office tomorrow morning. Tell them we are ready to discuss the terms of a complete surrender. The conference room at Sampson & Associates on the 40th floor was a theater designed for corporate slaughter. The long walnut table gleamed under the recessed lighting, cold and uninviting. Arthur sat at the head of the table, perfectly composed in his tailored tweed suit, his hands resting flat against the polished wood. Beside him sat Richard Sterling, exuding the quiet, terrifying power of a billionaire who had already won the war before the first shot was fired. Oliver stood near a digital projector, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. Sitting quietly in the corner was a man introduced only as Paul, the lead forensic accountant. At exactly 10 o'clock in the morning, the heavy glass doors swung open. Thomas walked in first. He looked like a hollow shell of a man, his suit hanging loosely on his frame, his eyes bloodshot and darting nervously around the room. Jessica followed closely behind him, radiating an aggressive, unearned arrogance. She wore a sharp crimson dress and stiletto heels, her chin tilted upward in defiance. She genuinely believed the temporary restraining order had made her untouchable. Their aggressive family law attorney trailed behind them, carrying a thick leather briefcase and wearing a smug smile. "Let us make this quick," Jessica's lawyer began, not even bothering to sit down. He tossed a legal pad onto the table. "My client holds a court-mandated restraining order against Mr. Pendleton. We are only here because you requested a mediation regarding the civil suit. Our terms are simple. You drop the ridiculous forgery allegations, you sign a non-disclosure agreement, and in exchange, Jessica will consider allowing supervised, restricted visitation with the minors in 6 months." Oliver did not look at the opposing counsel. He simply pressed a button on a remote control. The heavy automatic blinds hummed as they descended over the floor-to-ceiling windows, plunging the room into a tense, cinematic darkness. The projector flared to life, casting a stark white rectangle onto the far wall. "Please sit down," Oliver instructed, his voice entirely devoid of warmth. "This is not a negotiation. You have absolutely no leverage in this room." Jessica scoffed, rolling her eyes as she took a seat, crossing her legs. Thomas sank into the chair beside her, looking as though he might be sick. "Let us address the root cause of your failing investment firm, Thomas," Oliver said, pacing slowly near the projected screen. "You believed your business was failing due to market volatility. You believed you needed a $2 million commercial loan, secured by your father's forged signature, just to keep the lights on. You were wrong." Oliver nodded to Paul in the corner. The accountant pressed a key on his laptop. A complex, highlighted financial spreadsheet appeared on the screen. Over the past 24 months, Paul explained in a clinical, monotone voice, exactly $420,000 were systematically siphoned from your firm's operational accounts. These funds were labeled as external consulting fees and routed through a series of shell vendors. Thomas squinted at the screen, his confusion visible. "Consulting fees? I never authorized those. Who was receiving that money?" Paul clicked to the next slide. A blown-up image of a bank transfer receipt filled the wall. The destination was a joint checking account established at a private offshore bank. The account holders are listed as Jessica Pendleton and Ethan Carter. The name dropped into the silent room like a live grenade. Thomas froze, his breath catching in his throat. "Ethan? Who is Ethan? This is absurd." Jessica shrieked, her arrogant facade cracking instantly. She jumped to her feet, her face flushing a deep, panicked red. "This is doctored evidence. They are trying to frame me, Thomas. Do not listen to them." Oliver ignored her outburst and clicked the remote again. The spreadsheet vanished, replaced by a series of high-resolution, date-stamped photographs. There was Jessica, wearing the luxury cashmere coat bought with Arthur's stolen life savings, wrapping her arms around the heavily muscled fitness instructor. The next photo showed them kissing passionately in the lobby of a boutique hotel. The final image was a property deed for a luxury condominium downtown, purchased entirely with the embezzled corporate funds, registered solely under Jessica's name. The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. Thomas stared at the glowing screen. His eyes traced the contours of his wife's face as she kissed another man. He looked at the property deed bought with the money that had driven his company to the brink of collapse. The woman he had defended, the woman he had sacrificed his own father to protect, had been bleeding him dry to build a secret life with her young lover. "You ruined me," Thomas whispered, his voice cracking. He slowly turned his head to look at Jessica. The desperation in his eyes morphed into a profound, hollow horror. "You stole the money. You made me forge my dad's signature because you were stealing the money." "Thomas, baby, please," Jessica stammered, reaching out to touch his arm. Her hands were shaking violently. "It is not what it looks like. They are manipulating you." Thomas slapped her hand away with a violent flinch, as if her skin was made of burning acid. "Sit down, Jessica," Arthur commanded. His voice cut through the room, sharp and unforgiving. For the first time since they entered, Arthur stood up from the head of the table. He did not look at his son with pity. He looked at him with the stern, objective gaze of a professor waiting for a student to understand a complex equation. "The theft of the money is a federal crime," Arthur stated calmly. "The forgery of my legacy is a felony. The infidelity is a moral failure. But none of those are the reason you are sitting in this room today. Arthur pressed the remote control himself. The images of the affair vanished. In their place appeared the photograph of 9-year-old Leo, sitting alone on the frozen concrete bench outside his school, shivering in his thin jacket. The next slide showed 6-year-old Mia crying in the pharmacy aisles. Thomas gasped, his hands flying to his mouth. "Oh my God. Leo. While you were spending your afternoons in a hotel room funded by my stolen savings," Arthur said, looking directly into Jessica's terrified eyes, "my grandson was freezing on the streets. While you were purchasing luxury real estate with your lover, my granddaughter was wandering a pharmacy alone, suffering from a stress rash." Arthur tossed the stack of notarized affidavits onto the center of the table. "I have sworn statements from the school principal, the local pharmacist, and your neighbors. I have absolute, irrefutable proof of severe child neglect and emotional abuse. Your restraining order is built on perjury, Jessica, and these documents will not just get it overturned. They will send you to a federal penitentiary." Jessica's aggressive lawyer, who had been completely silent since the presentation began, slowly closed his leather briefcase. He leaned over and whispered frantically into Jessica's ear, telling her to stop talking immediately to avoid further self-incrimination. The smugness was entirely gone, replaced by the panicked realization that his client was completely indefensible. The heavy, suffocating illusion that Thomas had lived inside for years finally shattered into a million jagged pieces. He collapsed forward onto the table, burying his head in his arms, sobbing with the raw, agonizing grief of a man who realized he had destroyed his own life to protect a monster. He had allowed his father to be treated like a dog. He had allowed his children to be neglected and starved. All for a woman who despised him. Arthur watched his son weep. There was no joy in this victory, only the cold, necessary execution of justice. The foundation of their toxic kingdom had been obliterated. Now, it was time to dictate the terms of their surrender. The sound of Thomas weeping was the only noise echoing in the sterile corporate theater. It was the agonizing, guttural sound of a man mourning the death of his own illusions. Arthur stood at the head of the walnut table, his posture as rigid as carved stone. He felt no urge to walk over and embrace his son. The time for blind, enabling comfort had passed. Compassion, in its purest form, sometimes required a ruthless precision to cut away the rotting elements so the core could survive. Oliver pressed a switch on the wall. The heavy automatic blinds slowly ascended, letting the harsh daylight flood back into the room. The projector screen went dark, erasing the digital ghosts of Jessica's infidelity. "Tears will not erase the forgery, Thomas," Arthur said, his voice entirely devoid of sympathy. "And they will certainly not warm a freezing child. Sit up. We are going to finalize your future." Thomas slowly lifted his head. His eyes were red and swollen, his face slick with sweat. Beside him, Jessica sat perfectly still, her chest heaving as she finally realized the inescapable gravity of her situation. Her aggressive lawyer had already backed away from the table, silently packing his briefcase, eager to distance himself from a client who was clearly destined for a federal indictment. Oliver stepped forward and dropped two distinct, incredibly thick leather binders onto the table in front of Thomas. The heavy thud made Jessica flinch. "You are standing at the edge of a cliff," Arthur explained, pointing a steady finger at the documents. "You have exactly two choices on how you want to step off. I will only offer this once." Arthur gestured to the black binder on the left. "The first option is the path of absolute destruction. If you refuse to comply with my terms, Oliver will leave this building and hand the entire forensic accounting file to the federal authorities. We will press maximum charges for the $2 million bank fraud. We will file charges against Jessica for grand larceny and embezzlement. I will submit the sworn affidavits regarding Leo and Mia to the child welfare authorities. Both of you will be arrested before dinner. You will both serve lengthy prison sentences, your firm will be liquidated, and I will be granted full, permanent, and uncontested custody of my grandchildren. You will never see them again." Thomas choked on a sob, his hands trembling violently against his knees. "Or," Arthur continued, his voice dropping to a low, commanding register, "you choose the second option. The blue binder on the right." Arthur leaned forward, resting his palms on the polished wood. "You will sign the divorce papers Oliver has prepared, effective immediately. You will legally evict Jessica from the family home this afternoon. She will leave with nothing but the clothes on her back, as all her assets were purchased with stolen funds and are now subject to seizure. You will surrender your executive position at the firm and sign total operational control over to Richard's trust to begin repaying your massive debts. You will attend intensive psychiatric therapy, and you will complete mandatory parenting courses. You will start over from absolute zero, working a standard employee job to repay the $300,000 you stole from me. You will rebuild your life brick by brick, but you will do it honestly." "Thomas, you cannot do this," Jessica hissed, her voice dripping with venom and rising panic. She grabbed his arm, her manicured nails digging into his suit jacket. "He is bluffing. We can fight this in court. We can take the kids and run. Do not let this bitter old man ruin our family." Thomas looked down at the hand gripping his arm. For years, that hand had guided his every decision. It had pointed him away from his father. It had pushed him to commit felony fraud. It had spent his money on a younger lover while his own children went hungry. "Family," Thomas whispered. His voice was raw, scratching against his throat. He slowly looked up, his bloodshot eyes locking onto Jessica's terrified face. "You left my son outside in the snow. You bought a house for another man using my father's money. You do not know the meaning of the word family." Thomas violently yanked his arm away from her grasp. "You are a parasite." Jessica gasped, her eyes widening in pure shock. The obedient, terrified puppet she had controlled for nearly a decade had just cut his own strings. Without another word of hesitation, Thomas reached for the blue binder. He opened it to the signature page. Oliver smoothly handed him a heavy silver pen. Thomas did not read the legal jargon. He did not care about the strict conditions. He only cared about saving whatever small, fractured piece of his soul remained. He pressed the pen to the paper and signed his name with a heavy, definitive stroke, legally executing his own divorce and total financial surrender. The sound of the pen scratching across the paper snapped something inside Jessica. She let out a piercing, hysterical scream. "You coward," she shrieked, lunging across the table, trying to tear the documents away. "You pathetic, weak little man. I will take everything. I will ruin you." Richard calmly picked up the blue binder before her clawing hands could reach it, handing it safely to Oliver. Arthur did not even blink at her violent outburst. He simply pressed a small intercom button on the center of the table. Within seconds, the heavy glass doors burst open. Two massive security guards entered the conference room. Oliver pointed a calm finger at the screaming woman. "This individual is no longer permitted on the premises," Oliver stated cleanly. "Please escort her out of the building. If she resists, contact the local police precinct." The guards flanked Jessica immediately. One grabbed her left arm, the other grabbed her right. She thrashed wildly, her expensive heels kicking against the mahogany table, screaming profanities at Thomas, at Arthur, and at the billionaire who had orchestrated her downfall. Her voice echoed down the corridor, a chaotic symphony of rage and defeat, until the heavy doors swung shut and the elevator carried her away forever. The conference room fell into a profound, exhausted silence. Thomas sat slumped in his chair, staring blankly at the empty space where his wife had been sitting moments ago. He had nothing left. No money, no firm, no marriage. Arthur walked slowly around the table. He stood beside his son. For the first time in 3 years, he reached out and placed a firm, warm hand on Thomas's shoulder. "It is done," Arthur said quietly. "The rod has been removed. Tomorrow, you learn how to walk again." 6 months can feel like a fleeting moment or an entire lifetime, depending on the path you are walking. As the crisp autumn wind swept through the streets of Boston, scattering golden leaves across the pavement, the Pendleton family had finally settled into their new, hard-earned reality. Thomas now lived in a modest 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. He rode the subway every morning to a standard desk job at a local shipping company. His expensive tailored suits were gone, replaced by simple cotton shirts. He looked older, his face lined with the heavy weight of consequence, but the paralyzing fear that used to haunt his eyes had completely vanished. He attended his psychiatric therapy sessions twice a week without fail. Most importantly, he was finally learning how to be a real father. He cooked warm meals for Leo and Mia, helped them with their mathematics homework, and listened to them without the toxic background noise of a manipulative spouse. Jessica, on the other hand, had discovered exactly how cold the world could be without a stolen safety net. When her embezzled funds were seized by the federal authorities, her young fitness instructor vanished overnight. Without money or assets, her aggressive lawyer quickly abandoned her case. To avoid a lengthy prison sentence in a federal facility, she had accepted a severe plea deal. She now spent her days completing hundreds of hours of court-mandated community service, wearing a bright orange safety vest as she picked up trash along the very downtown sidewalks she used to strut across in designer heels. Up in the quiet sanctuary of the 52nd floor penthouse, Arthur Pendleton stood by the massive glass window, a warm cup of Earl Grey tea in his hands. It was Saturday morning. The penthouse was no longer silent. From the kitchen, the joyful sound of Mia giggling and Leo asking Richard Sterling a barrage of endless questions about computer science echoed down the hallway. Arthur smiled, watching the morning sun reflect off the surrounding skyscrapers. He had spent his entire life studying philosophy, searching for the complex meaning of human suffering. But the greatest lesson he ever learned was not written in any of his textbooks. He had learned that blind, silent sacrifice does not protect a family. It only feeds the darkness. True love requires immense courage. It requires the strength to establish unbreakable boundaries and the wisdom to demand basic human respect. When his son and daughter-in-law pushed him out into the freezing snow, they assumed his old, grieving heart would simply shatter under the pressure. But they had forgotten a fundamental law of nature. When you apply unimaginable, crushing pressure to a piece of coal, it does not turn to dust. It becomes a diamond. And a diamond never breaks. It only shines. Looking back, Arthur realized that sometimes you have to burn down the illusion of what you wanted in order to build the reality of what you truly deserve. What about you, our dear listeners? How did this story make you feel today? Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you had to set a difficult boundary with someone you deeply love just to protect your own peace? How does Arthur's journey relate to your own real-life experiences? We sincerely hope you will share your thoughts in the comments below. We want to listen to the feelings straight from the depths of your heart. The greatest life lesson we can take from this story is that family is truly precious, but your self-respect is absolutely not for sale. Forgiveness does not mean blindly accepting abuse. It means choosing your own peace over endless resentment and having the courage to walk away from toxicity. If you found value and emotion in this journey today, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it with your friends and family so you can listen to many more captivating stories every single day. We want to take this moment to wish everyone watching this video abundant health, a joyful life, and daily peace in your soul. Goodbye, and we will see you in the next video.